What's cracking, guys? Omar Isuf here, back with another video. In this video today, squats. Oh, I'm making another squat video, but this time I have a guest. Aesthetic Strength, aka Brandon Teets, is going to be on the channel today discussing how to optimize the squat for the individual. And what I mean, have you ever watched a video on squatting or squatting tips and it just kind of doesn't feel right for you, doesn't fit right, or you might see a ton of different videos offering a variety of opinions and you don't know which one to pick? The answer kind of lies somewhere in the middle, where it depends once again upon the individual or their morphology. Brendan today in this video is going to break this down, essentially how to make these decisions for yourself in order to optimize your squat. So if you like this video, if you maybe want to see it turned into a series, make sure to like the damn video, leave a comment below, but I'll let Brendan do the rest of the talking.
What's up, YouTube? What's going on, guys? My name is Brandon Teets. I'm a competitive powerlifter in the USPA Federation. I compete in the 198-pound class. And today Omar Isuf asked me to actually come on his channel, do a video for him, and if you guys like it, we're going to take this and kind of turn it into a series depending on how it goes over. But the idea here is we're going to be going over the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift over a few videos and talking about the biomechanics behind it, how your form is going to differ from one person to another depending on your morphology and just the way you're anatomically set up, and kind of some pragmatic applications of how you can take all this information and apply it to your own training. So today we're going to be talking about the squat, and we're going to go over three main things. And the first one's going to be squat width and how wide you should be squatting or how narrow, and your toe placement. So overall there's kind of three main ways to squat. One's going to be a very narrow squat. You might see an Olympic lifter doing this. This is with your heel at about hip width. The next is going to be at about shoulder width. And then the third is going to be a wide squat stance. Now, if you talk to people in the industry, usually they're going to have one way that they think is the best way to squat. But what I want to talk about is your morphology and how you're anatomically built and how that's going to affect the way you squat. You can see here in these clips that I'm going to splice into the video, I have my buddy Taurus here, who's a competitive powerlifter as well. I think he squatted up to about 600 pounds in competition at 173-pound body weight, and he squats extremely wide. This is way too wide for me. I could never squat this way, but he is built to be able to actually do this, as where me, I've also squatted 600 pounds, but I squat very narrow. I do get my toes out and my knees out very wide, but my actual stance with where my heels are placed is pretty narrow. And then you have someone like Gina, which I'm showing you here in these clips, and she's kind of in between us. She's a little bit wider than me, but not as wide as Taurus. And we're all very high level squatters. She's even squatted, I think, about 400 pounds in competition. And we all have our own way of doing it, and it's based on our anatomy. So you can see me here doing this drill that I actually pulled off of Instagram from Dr. Jacob Harden. I used to just have my clients and anyone who asked try out the different squat stance widths, but you can see me doing this drill that I got from him, which kind of fast tracks this entire thing. So all you got to do is get down into this prone position, put your knees next to each other in a very narrow stance, and then go slightly wider, and then even wider than that. And in each of these stances, you're going to just gently push back your body, as you see me doing, until you see a pelvic tilt where you get your butt wink, or until you feel some pain in your hips. Now, the one where you can keep the most neutral core and keep the best position without pain is probably going to be the best position for you. You can see in the extremely wide stance squat, I'm not able to really keep a neutral pelvis. Like, my butt tucks under me and I get a lot of hip pain, as where Taurus can be in this really wide stance squat, or excuse me, wide stance position, and he can push all the way back into full flexion with a very neutral back and without pain. So that's kind of how you'd set up your stance width, really based on your morphology. Now let's kind of get down into the nitty gritty. Let's talk about toe placement. Do we want to squat with our toes forward, or our toes more out, or our toes really out? And again, this is going to depend on your morphology. So there's a lot of ways to kind of go over this, but the one that I found to be the main indicator of where you want your toes to be pointed is from your internal rotation of your hip, kind of your natural mobility there. You can see Gina here, who squats about 400 pounds in competition. She's able to squat with a very toes forward position, and she does it at a really high level, and she does it without pain and while staying very healthy and really strong. But she's able to do this because of the amount of internal hip rotation she has. From that toes forward squat, you're going to get a lot of internal hip rotation in the bottom of the squat, where that femur really kind of comes forward on you, kind of towards the interior, and that can cause a lot of pain for people. But you can see when I'm doing the stretch on her, she's able to get 30 or 40 degrees of range of motion on her internal rotators of her hip, as where when I do it, it's kind of pathetic and I can only budge maybe 5 degrees or so. I hardly have any internal hip rotation. Now, can I fix this from mobility? Sure, but from a pragmatic standpoint, my mobility is never going to be as good as hers in that position because I'm just set up differently. The way my femur inserts into my socket or thigh bone here, it's probably a lot different than Gina's. If we were to cut me open and stare at her compared to myself, you would see very different hip anatomies, and from that, it really changes the way we want to stand with our squat. So I go toes out, and although I'm kind of a moderate, almost narrow stance squatter, I'm able to get my toes out and really jam the knees out like I'm supposed to do, which clears room in that hip, and I'm not very toes forward like she is. Otherwise, I run into that hip impingement. So those are kind of two ways to set up the stance width and the stance, your toe placement in the squat. Let's go over some grip width differences from one athlete to another. What we really want to do with our elbows and things like that. So before we even get into that, what's the goal of our grip position when we squat? Well, really, we want what we call torso rigidity. Basically, we want our torso to get very rigid and tight and create stability. That way, when we're going down in the squat, we can come back up nice and stable and we don't get any goofiness going on at our spine. So to achieve this, we want to think kind of what our back muscles do and what the torso is really designed to do when we're trying to keep it stable. If you think about a dumbbell row, when I go down to do a dumbbell row, I'm not letting my elbow flare way out here and just putting it on my internal rotators and that rear delt in the trap. I'm trying to get my elbow nice and close and flexing out the lats, trying to flex out the rear delt and the trap all together in unison to get overall back activation. Same thing when we go to squat, we want to get the whole back to flex and keep us stable. So I think the best way from a theoretical kind of standpoint, I guess you could say, to design your squat is to get the elbows nice and underneath the bar and get your back very tight. You can see here, although Gina and myself and Chance and Taurus, we all have different ways of how wide we grip on the bar, some kind of similar to others, but overall it's differing. We all do very similar things where we try to tuck those elbows underneath the bar, and that allows us to engage the lat. When that elbow flares, we lose that tightness inside the lat, and it all just goes to the trap and upper back, and we get that weird rounding of the spine. So tucking those elbows theoretically is best. But let's take this even further. From a pragmatic standpoint, there's a lot of people who deal with what's called epicondylitis, basically elbow pain, tennis elbow, and from that force being directly over that elbow, that's going to cause a lot of direct force transfer onto the elbow joints. And because when I do this, I use what's called a broken wrist position where my wrist is in extreme extension, this can lead to a lot of elbow pain for some people. And if that's you, squatting this way isn't going to be best because you're going to end up injured. So you're someone who might want to think about hooking their wrist over and kind of letting the elbow get back a little bit, but not too much so where we can still engage the lat, or kind of, changing your form there. And what I'm trying to get you to understand is just because something is theoretical and optimal on paper doesn't mean in the real world it plays out like that. Because if you just keep getting elbow pain and you can't bench press now and you can't do upper body work because your squatting form is so perfect, is that really the best way to approach this? Probably not. So grip width and arm placement is all going to depend on how you're set up, what injuries you're dealing with. But overall, if you can, try to get that elbow tucked nice and underneath the bar. I prefer a broken wrist position with a full grip. You can use a false grip that's going to put more pressure on that distal bicep and take it off of the elbow though, and vice versa. So depending on which injury you're dealing with, you can kind of differ it there. But play around with this and see what works best for you in training, and that's kind of what I think is optimal for grip placement. All right, guys, the last thing I want to talk about today is the actual movement of the squat itself. What we're going to go over are two main things I see people doing wrong. First is timing of the hips and knees during the descent or the eccentric portion of the squat. And then secondly, we're going to talk about external rotation at the hip joint, which just, if you don't know what that means, basically getting the knees out. Now, that second one, a lot of squatters at a high level do really good with externally rotating at the hip, getting the knees out. I'm one of them. I squat I squat semi-narrow, but my knees jam out really far. And what this actually does for me is, because I have lanky legs and I'm not very quad dominant, I try to take the demand off of my quads. And so when I go down into a squat position, if I'm going knees forward, I have to shoot my hips way back here and my quads have to do a lot of work to press out of this hole. But when I jam these knees out, I'm able to get more upright, and it puts a little bit more demand on my hip extensors and a little less on my quads, and it allows me to really kind of transiently shorten my femur length, my thigh bone length, because I'm jamming those knees out to the side. They don't have to go as forward as much, and my ass doesn't have to shoot way back like this. Now, there's squatters like my buddy Chance Mitchell, who squats very knees forward, and he does great with it because he happens to be very strong in his quads. And you can see in these videos, this dude's stronger than me on the squat, and they're flying up. But I'm kind of the opposite. Even though I have to squat kind of narrow, not as narrow as him, but similar, I'm not quad dominant, and I have very lanky femurs. And so for me, I really try to jam those knees out, externally rotate that hip. So I guess a rule of thumb for you guys, because there is no one way. Everyone hears that you have to jam the knees out, but how much really depends on your anatomy. And so the lankier you are, I would say usually you're going to do better by getting those knees out, and kind of the stockier limbs you have, and or the stronger quad dominance in your body that you kind of maintain, you're probably going to do better with a little bit more knees forward squat. The one universal rule though is, as we're coming out of that squat hole, we don't want to see the knees cave inwards at all past our midline. They always have to at least stay nice and linear and straight. We just don't want to see any inward movement, that knee valgus. That's going to be bad for the knee joint. So we do want to keep them kind of out and our adductors firing a little bit, but how much is going to depend on your build. So that's number one. The other thing I want to talk about is timing the hips and knees. Now, I don't want to get too in depth on this, but there's this thing we call the stretch reflex. Now, all that is basically when we stretch a muscle, it increases the neurological activity in that muscle, and it allows us to actually get some extra generated power when we go to perform the concentric after that stretch. So if you think about, if any of you guys have ever deadlifted for more than one rep, which I'm sure a lot of you have, sometimes you might notice the first rep feels harder than the second rep. And that's because, especially if you don't use a hip shoot, we start with that concentric phase where we just have to exert power, and our muscles don't have that stretch being placed on them before that concentric, and so there is no stretch reflex happening. Think about it kind of like a rubber band. When we stretch it back, that rubber band's going to come snapping back into place, and it's kind of similar to the way muscles work. When we stretch them out, like when we go down into that squat, we're stretching, stretching, stretching. When we go to exert that force back out of that squat hole, we get that stretch reflex. Now, what I see people doing wrong is the timing of their hips and knees. A lot of time people will shoot their butt way back and then dive onto the quads last second, and that's kind of dramatic, but that's what will happen. And what this does is it stretches out the hip extensors a lot, and then last minute we kind of get the stretch onto the quads, not as much as the hip extensors, and this kind of unevenly tensions the muscles that are performing the squat. And so what we see is bad movement pattern coming out of that hole, and we don't get a full stretch reflex on those quadricep muscles. Or the opposite, people come too much onto the knees and they never get the hips back, and so not only is this bad positioning, but you're losing that stretch reflex on both of these muscle groups. So how can we time this better? Well, in these videos, you can see from all these squatters that I've used to demonstrate today, we all time our knees and our hip joints at the same time. And what I mean by that is when we go down into that hole, our knees open up or break at the same time that our hips open up and or break. So we jam those knees out and the hips back, sink down, and then come back up nice and even. We don't do hips first and then knees, and we don't do knees first and then the hips. We are timing them together. That may sound pretty obvious, but I see so many people making this mistake. And if you do this properly, not only are you going to end up in a better position, you're going to catch a better stretch reflex, you're going to have a lot more even tension to stay upright and come out of that squat hole perfectly. I think that's it, guys. We talked a lot today. This is probably a longer video than I wanted to be. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, let me know in the comment section. Go check out my own YouTube page if you can. I'm sure he'll link it in the description or something like that. And thank you so much, Omar, for letting me come onto the channel. I will see you guys next time.
Well, that's all the time we have. My thanks to Brendan for doing this video. Make sure once again to check out his channel. Link is going to be in the description. And if you want this turned into a series when it comes to other movements and how to optimize them, make sure to leave a comment below. That's all the time we have. I'm looking right into your soul. If you liked the video, make sure to like the damn video, and I'll be seeing all you guys, my rascals, in that next one. Peace.